During the height of the Cold War, the CIA understood one hard truth. Penetrating the KGB from the outside was nearly impossible. Soviet counterintelligence was built on paranoia, compartmentalization, and constant internal surveillance. Foreign recruitment inside the USSR was rare, dangerous, and usually short-lived. If the CIA wanted long-term access to Soviet secrets, it would have to do something far more ambitious, place an agent so deep inside the system that he appeared to belong there. By the late 1960s, American intelligence began experimenting with a high-risk strategy known inside counterintelligence circles as controlled insertion. The idea was not to recruit an existing Soviet officer, but to carefully construct a candidate who could eventually be accepted into the KGB itself. This meant years of preparation, fabricated background elements, ideological reliability, and a personal history that could withstand intense scrutiny. On paper, the plan was elegant. In reality, it bordered on suicidal. The Soviet Union did not recruit blindly. Every KGB officer was subjected to exhaustive background checks, repeated vetting, and long periods of observation. Personal relationships, family history, education, and even psychological stability were monitored. Any inconsistency, no matter how small, could end a career or trigger an investigation. The CIA knew this. That was why the operation was designed to unfold slowly, almost invisibly. The candidate chosen for insertion was not a spy in the traditional sense. He was trained to be patient, disciplined, and above all, unremarkable. His role was not to steal documents immediately, but to survive. Years would pass before any meaningful access was gained. The CIA accepted that the operation might take a decade before producing results, if it survived at all. What the CIA underestimated was not Soviet technology, but Soviet intuition. By the early 1970s, the KGB had become deeply suspicious of long-term Western strategies. After several painful intelligence failures, Soviet counterintelligence shifted its focus. Instead of hunting for obvious traitors, it began searching for patterns, subtle anomalies in behavior, career progression, and personal conduct that did not fit statistical norms. This change in approach proved decisive. The suspected agent did not fail dramatically. He did not make contact with Western handlers. He did not pass secrets. He followed the rules carefully, too carefully. His discipline, emotional restraint, and lack of personal weakness made him stand out, not as a threat, but as an anomaly. To experienced KGB officers, this kind of perfection was unnatural. Quietly, without confrontation, the KGB began testing him. Small psychological pressures were introduced. Career delays, conflicting instructions, minor security challenges. Each test was designed to provoke an unscripted response. The goal was not to catch him spying, but to observe how he reacted when the system behaved unpredictably. From the outside, nothing seemed wrong. From the inside, the trap was already closing. By the time American intelligence realized that Soviet counterintelligence might be aware of the operation, it was too late to intervene. Any attempt to extract or contact the agent would confirm suspicions. Silence was the only option. The CIA could only watch and wait. The KGB, meanwhile, did not rush. Arrest was not the objective. Understanding was. Soviet counterintelligence wanted to know whether this was an isolated attempt or part of a broader CIA strategy. The suspected agent remained under observation, unaware of how thoroughly his life was being dissected. What followed was not a dramatic exposure, but something far more dangerous for Western intelligence. The Soviet Union did not simply identify the intrusion. It began to learn from it. The CIA had planted an agent inside the KGB, but the USSR did not respond with force. It responded with patience, and that patience would soon turn the operation into a lesson. The CIA would not forget. Once suspicion took root, the KGB did not act impulsively. Soviet counterintelligence had learned that premature arrests often destroyed valuable opportunities. Instead of exposing the suspected agent, the KGB shifted into a mode designed not to eliminate the threat, but to exploit it. The objective was no longer to prove guilt. It was to understand the logic behind the CIA's operation. Surveillance intensified, but invisibly. Phone calls were monitored, not for incriminating content, but for patterns. Meetings were observed, not for contacts, but for behavioral deviations. Even moments of solitude were noted. The KGB wanted to know how the suspected agent reacted to isolation, uncertainty, and subtle pressure. Every reaction was catalogued. At the same time, the agent's professional environment was carefully manipulated. Access to sensitive material was adjusted, sometimes expanded, sometimes restricted without explanation. Instructions were deliberately made ambiguous. Supervisors offered contradictory guidance. These controlled disruptions were designed to test adaptability. A genuine Soviet officer would complain, improvise, or seek clarification. A planted agent might hesitate, attempting to remain perfectly aligned with expectations. The results were telling. The suspected officer remained calm, disciplined, and unusually cautious. He avoided emotional responses, accepted setbacks without visible frustration, and never questioned authority openly. On the surface, this behavior appeared ideal. To experienced KGB officers, it was unsettling. Loyalty in the Soviet system was rarely flawless. Real people made mistakes. They argued, complained, and revealed insecurity. Perfection suggested preparation. By this stage, the KGB was confident that it was dealing with a foreign intelligence construct rather than a recruited traitor. This distinction mattered. A recruited agent could be interrogated and neutralized. A constructed agent revealed something far more valuable: the CIA's methodology. How long was the preparation? What psychological profile had been selected? What weaknesses had American intelligence failed to anticipate? The KGB decided not to expose the operation publicly. Instead, it transformed the suspected agent into a controlled variable. His career continued, but along a carefully managed path. Promotions were delayed just enough to prevent access to strategic intelligence. Assignments were shifted laterally rather than upward. He remained inside the system, visible yet contained. From the CIA's perspective, the situation became increasingly dangerous. Years had been invested in the operation, but intelligence flow remained non-existent. Attempts to assess the agent's status through indirect indicators yielded nothing. The absence of arrests could mean success, or something far worse. In hostile intelligence environments, silence often precedes collapse. American analysts debated intervention. Extraction was impossible without confirmation. Contact would risk exposure. Doing nothing preserved the illusion of safety. The CIA chose patience, unaware that Soviet counterintelligence was already several steps ahead. Behind closed doors, the KGB began running internal simulations. If the CIA was willing to attempt such a deep insertion, it suggested desperation or strategic ambition. The operation hinted at a shift in American thinking, away from short-term recruitment and toward generational intelligence planning. This insight alone justified allowing the agent to remain in place. The suspected officer was never informed of the scrutiny. He continued to live under the belief that his cover was intact. His discipline, once his greatest asset, became his greatest liability. Every correct decision reinforced suspicion. Every cautious action confirmed preparation. By the mid-1970s, the KGB had effectively neutralized the operation without confrontation. No trial, no confession, no public case. The CIA agent existed inside the KGB, but he no longer mattered. He was observed, contained, and studied, an intelligent specimen rather than a threat. The trap had been spotted early. What followed was not a purge, but a lesson. And that lesson would soon be turned outward, shaping how the Soviet Union responded to future CIA operations. As the operation dragged on, the KGB began to see an opportunity that went beyond simple containment. The suspected CIA agent had become a window into American intelligence thinking. Every choice he made, every hesitation, every adjustment under pressure offered clues about how the CIA trained, evaluated, and controlled its assets. For Soviet counterintelligence, this was more valuable than a confession. The KGB quietly assembled a small analytical group to study the case. Their task was not operational, but strategic. They reconstructed the agent's presumed preparation from the beginning, the type of education he had received, the psychological conditioning he displayed, and the behavioral discipline he maintained. Patterns emerged. The CIA, they concluded, favored agents who avoided emotional exposure, minimized risk, and followed doctrine even when flexibility was required. This insight would later influence how the KGB designed its own countermeasures. Meanwhile, the agent's life inside the system grew increasingly constrained. He was never accused, never confronted, and never warned. Instead, he was slowly isolated. Access to sensitive conversations diminished. Informal networks excluded him without explanation. His professional world narrowed, though outwardly his career appeared stable. The KGB understood that isolation was the most effective pressure. A trained agent could endure interrogation. He could not easily adapt to meaninglessness. From the CIA's perspective, the operation had entered a dangerous limbo. Years had passed without contact or output. Analysts could not determine whether the agent had failed, succeeded, or been compromised. In high-risk operations, uncertainty was the worst possible signal. Yet the absence of overt Soviet action created false reassurance. No arrests meant no exposure, or so it seemed. Behind the scenes, the KGB began using the suspected agent as a calibration tool. Internal security exercises were adjusted around him. New monitoring techniques were tested to see whether he reacted differently than genuine officers. When security rules were altered without explanation, his responses were compared against control groups. Each comparison reinforced the same conclusion. He behaved like someone trained to survive scrutiny, not like someone who had grown inside the system. Still, the KGB resisted the temptation to end the operation. Exposing the agent would provide satisfaction, but little intelligence value. Keeping him in place preserved leverage. It also denied the CIA closure. American intelligence had invested resources, time, and trust into a construct that no longer produced results, yet could not be safely abandoned. By the late 1970s, the operation had effectively reversed. The CIA believed it had an agent inside the KGB. In reality, the KGB had an unwitting subject inside its own ranks, one it fully understood, but never acknowledged. This asymmetry was deliberate. The Soviet Union did not need proof for public display. It needed understanding. The psychological toll on the agent was invisible but severe. Years of discipline produced no reward, no progress, no validation, no communication. His training had prepared him for danger, not for stagnation. Yet any attempt to break routine or seek attention would only confirm suspicion. He remained trapped by his own perfection. For Soviet counterintelligence, the case reinforced a critical lesson. Deep cover operations could be defeated not by force, but by time. A constructed identity, no matter how detailed, would eventually diverge from organic behavior. Systems built by intelligence agencies left signatures. Patience exposed them. As the Cold War moved into a new phase, the KGB quietly archived the operation, not as a closed case, but as a reference model. Future CIA attempts would be measured against it. Recruitment profiles adjusted. Counterintelligence doctrine refined. The suspected agent remained in place. A silent reminder that infiltration was not always a victory for the infiltrator. The CIA had planted an agent inside the KGB, but by trying to control every variable, it had created one it could no longer control. And the Soviet Union, having spotted the trap early, had turned it into a long-term advantage. By the early 1980s, the operation had reached a strange equilibrium. The suspected CIA agent remained inside the KGB structure. Officially trusted, unofficially irrelevant. He occupied a position that looked legitimate from the outside, but led nowhere on the inside. For Soviet counterintelligence, this was the ideal outcome. The threat had been neutralized without exposure, and the intelligence value continued to accumulate quietly. The KGB now faced a strategic choice. Ending the operation would confirm to the CIA that its attempt had failed. Allowing it to continue preserved ambiguity. Soviet leadership favored the second option. Ambiguity created uncertainty on the other side, forcing American intelligence to waste time, resources, and attention on an asset that no longer mattered. Silence became a weapon. Internally, the case was used as a training reference. New counterintelligence officers were briefed on the patterns observed. Excessive discipline, emotional flatness, doctrinal consistency under stress. These traits were not proof of espionage, but they were indicators. The lesson was clear. Western intelligence agencies trained agents to survive systems. The KGB needed to observe how people failed to adapt when systems behaved irrationally. The suspected agent's psychological state continued to deteriorate, though no report ever recorded it directly. He remained careful, obedient, and restrained. Years passed without advancement or purpose. His training told him to wait. His instincts told him something was wrong. But intuition was a luxury he could not afford. Any deviation from routine could trigger exposure. In attempting to remain invisible, he became isolated. From the CIA's side, the operation had become a quiet burden. Analysts reviewing the case found no evidence of success, but also no evidence of compromise. Terminating the operation risked abandoning a potentially intact asset. Continuing it risked nothing, but gained nothing. This paralysis reflected a deeper problem. The CIA could not see what the KGB had already understood. The operation was no longer alive. Soviet counterintelligence exploited this uncertainty. Disinformation channels were subtly adjusted, harmless but misleading. Signals were allowed to circulate within controlled environments. If the CIA was still watching, it would receive confirmation that the agent remained safe and operational. In reality, nothing of value passed through him. The brilliance of the KGB's approach lay in restraint. No dramatic arrests, no public accusations, no forced confessions. Exposure would end the lesson. Silence extended it. The operation became a study in how intelligence agencies misread absence as success. As Cold War tensions flared and subsided, the case remained unchanged. The agent aged. His relevance faded. His presence no longer mattered operationally, but it mattered symbolically. He represented a boundary the CIA had crossed and failed to hold. Eventually, the Soviet Union itself began to change. Political reforms weakened old structures. Intelligence priorities shifted. Files were reorganized. Some cases were closed. This one was not. It remained open not because it was active, but because it was instructive. The KGB had not simply spotted a trap. It had demonstrated that deep infiltration could be defeated without confrontation. By denying feedback, purpose, and escalation, the system had absorbed the intrusion and rendered it harmless. The CIA had planted an agent inside the KGB. The USSR had not removed him. It had neutralized him by understanding him better than his creators did. The end of the operation would not come with an arrest or a confession. It would come quietly, through irrelevance. And that, for Soviet counterintelligence, was the most complete victory possible. The operation never ended with an arrest. There was no public exposure, no confession, no dramatic moment that could be pointed to as its conclusion. Instead, it faded into silence, which was exactly how the KGB intended it to end. By refusing to act openly, Soviet counterintelligence denied the CIA what it needed most: clarity. For the suspected agent, the end came not through punishment, but through erosion. Years passed without progress, without access, without purpose. His presence inside the KGB became purely administrative. He was neither trusted nor suspected in any formal sense. He simply existed within the structure, carefully observed and carefully ignored. His training had prepared him for danger, not for irrelevance. From the KGB's perspective, the case confirmed a central belief of Soviet counterintelligence doctrine. The most effective way to defeat a deep cover operation was not exposure, but absorption. A foreign intelligence construct could be neutralized by being allowed to exist without function. This approach avoided diplomatic consequences, denied the enemy operational feedback, and transformed an intrusion into a source of long-term insight. Internally, the case was preserved as a reference. It influenced how future recruitment attempts were assessed and how behavioral anomalies were interpreted. The lesson was not that the CIA lacked skill. It was that even the most carefully designed identities carried invisible signatures. Time, not force, revealed them. For the CIA, the operation became one of many unresolved cases buried inside classified archives. Analysts could never definitively determine whether the agent had failed, been compromised, or simply lost relevance. This uncertainty lingered long after the Cold War ended. In intelligence work, ambiguity is often more damaging than failure. It prevents learning. The broader significance of the case lay in what it revealed about the limits of infiltration. Deep insertion promised unparalleled access, but it also demanded absolute control over variables that could never be fully controlled. Culture, intuition, and institutional behavior could not be replicated perfectly. The KGB did not need proof of espionage. It needed probability. As Soviet archives slowly opened decades later, fragments of similar cases emerged. They revealed a pattern rarely discussed publicly. Not every spy was arrested. Some were simply neutralized through patience. Their stories left no courtroom records, no headlines, and no acknowledgement. Only silence. The CIA had planted an agent. Inside the KGB, the USSR had spotted the trap quickly. But instead of springing it, Soviet counterintelligence turned it into something far more useful: a mirror. By watching how the agent behaved under pressure, isolation, and stagnation, the KGB learned as much about American intelligence culture as any document could have revealed. This is why the story is deeper than a failed operation. It is about restraint as a weapon, silence as a strategy, and time as the most effective counterintelligence tool of all. In the end, no one won publicly. No medals were awarded. No failures were announced. But inside intelligence history, the lesson remains clear. Sometimes the most dangerous response to an infiltration is not exposure, but understanding. The CIA attempted to place an agent inside the KGB. The Soviet Union did not react with force. It reacted with patience. And in the long, quiet game of intelligence, patience was enough.